I have a story for you. Are you ready? Here we go. There were 3 friends, and they were going camping. But first, they had to walk through their neighbor's yard. And he had a big garden. And he was always telling them, don't step on the plants. Walk around the garden. But it was such a long way around, they decided that they would just tiptoe through that garden. And they looked this way and they looked that way and they didn't see him. So in they went very carefully through the garden. But guess who was right there in the middle of the garden, bent down low, pulling weeds? It was the gardener. And as they got close, he stood up and he made a grumpy face and he said, And then he did this. He winked at them. And they thought, winking is friendly. What's going on? But then they felt themselves growing smaller and smaller and smaller until they were very little. And they looked way up at the gardener. And he looked down at them and he said, when you learn to respect the plants, then you can be big again. So he did this. And a friend of his came and landed on his shoulder, a beautiful bright red cardinal. And he talked to the cardinal. And the cardinal flew down and picked the 3 friends up in his beak, in his foot, and flew away with them over the garden, over a meadow, over a forest, and then down into the forest, doop, 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 down, and he put them down and he flew away. Now, the 3 friends looked at each other and they immediately began to pat the stem of the nearest giant plant. We respect you, we respect you, we respect you, we respect you. And then they waited, but it didn't work. They didn't get big again. Well, said one of the friends, this is a survival situation, and we have got to figure out how to meet our survival needs. Fire, water, shelter, food. But which one shall we do first? Just at that moment, whoosh, splash! An enormous raindrop fell right in front of them and splashed all over them. Oh, they said, we're going to need shelter first. And they looked around and they saw a perfect plant to help them. It was tall and it had leaves like an umbrella. It was a mayapple. And they ran and they hid under the mayapple, and it was big enough to cover all of them. And they sat and watched the rain fall. But they were comfortable and dry. And it wasn't a long rain shower. It was done soon. And the friends, they came out from under the mayapple and they said, thank you so much for protecting us from the rain, mayapple. Then one of them said, I am hungry. Food, that's another survival priority, they said. Let's go find something to eat. Now, they looked around and they said, all of these plants are really, really big. How can we eat them? And then one of the friends said, we could eat pollen. You know that yellow powdery stuff on flowers? If we could get a flower with some pollen, as long as it's safe to eat. Oh, how about dandelion? We know we can eat dandelions. Let's go find a dandelion. Well, pretty soon they found one, and it looked to them like a tall, tall palm tree. But one of them was a very good climber, and scooch, 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 all the way up the trunk, and then leaned that big tall stem over so everybody could reach that lovely golden dandelion flower. And they gently reached in and scooped off pollen, and they ate plenty and they felt good. But then they realized that the sun was starting to set and it was getting cold. And somebody said, well, we'll need a fire. And then they realized they didn't have anything with them to make a fire. And maybe it was too late at night to try to make fire with a bow drill. And, oh gosh, what were they going to do? And then somebody said, haven't I heard of a plant that makes its own heat? Oh, it was skunk cabbage. You know, skunk cabbage flowers, they come up while it's still snowy sometimes, and they have to melt their way up. And they need heat to send out a very bad smell so that insects will want to come in and pollinate them. And maybe if we could find one of those flowers, it'll be making some heat and we can get warm in there. I guess it'll be smelly, but let's try it. They knew that skunk cabbage likes to grow where it's wet. So they looked around and they saw where the ground started to get damp, and they went that way. And the ground got squishy and a little wet, and then they found a skunk cabbage flower. And they went over there, and yes, it was stinky. But they went inside that flower, and it was warm. And they all leaned up against the walls, and they fell asleep, and they felt just fine. And they woke up in the morning, and they said, oh, skunk cabbage, thank you so much for being our fire and keeping us warm. But now they figured out they were very thirsty. Nobody had had anything to drink in a long time. They looked at that wet, squishy ground, and they saw a few little puddles, but everything was muddy, and they didn't think that water looked like it was safe to drink. We need a non-poisonous plant that might catch dew. Morning dew. Yeah, we could drink dew. And then somebody saw that in this damp place, there was lots and lots of moss growing. So some of them held out their hands, and another one of them gently squeezed some moss leaves, and water came into their hands, and they drank, and they felt so good. Now, they all said, thank you, moss, for giving us water. And then they said to each other, we have to remember to be really, really nice to the plants, because they give us everything. And just as someone said that, boing, 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 a mouse, to them it was a giant mouse, came bouncing into their little area, laid down flat on its belly, and then laid its chin down flat on the ground and just looked at them. And one of the friends stepped up and stroked the mouse's fur, and then climbed onto the mouse's back and said, hey, I think this mouse wants us to ride it. They all climbed on and held on to the fur, and the mouse stood up and boing, 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 off she went. And all of them went bouncing, bouncing, bouncing through the forest, bounce, 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 through the meadow, bounce, 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 and through the garden. And the mouse lay down on its belly again, and the friends slid off, and they stood up, and they looked up, and there was the gardener, the giant, giant gardener. And he looked down at them, and he did this. He winked at them, and they started to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until they were their usual size. And the gardener said, I see you have learned how to respect the plants. How wonderful. And I bet you have a really good story to tell. Won't you tell it to me?" And the friends looked at each other and they thought, "Well, I don't think anybody else is going to believe us. So yes, we would love to tell you our story." And they did. And that's the end of the story.